They buried him in the shallow earth just before sunrise, a small body, wrapped in a cloth soaked through with tears and goat's milk. No name carved, no priest called, because he wasn't baptized, because he never cried, because the midwife had whispered a warning when she cut the cord. The mother hadn't noticed anything strange. The skin was pale, yes, but all babies are pale when they enter the world in winter. His fingers curled tightly around her hair. He blinked, but he did not scream, not once. The villagers said nothing that day. They brought dried bread. They crossed themselves. They avoided the cradle, and when the sun fell and the wind returned, the house grew cold, too cold. The kind of cold that doesn't come from weather, the kind that leaks through the seams in the wood and settles in your lungs like a warning. On the second night, they heard it. A soft sound, not a cry, never a cry, just a breath. A slow, wet rasp, like air pulled through damp cloth. It came from the corner where the crib used to be, where there was now only folded linens and a rust-coloured stain on the floor. The mother didn't sleep. She clutched the blanket to her chest. She watched the door, though no one knocked. By the third night, the milk began to sour. The cat would not enter the room, and in the morning, the firewood was soaked through, though the roof didn't leak. The baby was still dead, but not gone. The midwife returned quietly. She said nothing, just opened her pouch and scattered ash at the threshold. She hung wolf's bane above the door. She told them to keep a silver spoon under their tongues while they slept. Then she leaned in close and said the word no one wanted to hear. Moroi, a spirit that should not have risen. A child taken too soon, too wrongly, too far from the grace of God. The villagers nodded. They had heard the tales, spirits that steal breath instead of blood, eyes that glow behind shutters, small feet that leave no prints. They gathered torches that night. They returned to the grave, and they dug. The cloth was torn open, the body still intact. No rot, no smell, but the lips were wet and the eyes open. The father stumbled back. The mother dropped to her knees, but the midwife moved forward. She drove the stake herself, not into the heart. That was for men, for monsters. For a Moroi, it had to be the mouth, to stop the whisper, to silence the hunger. The body twitched once, then twice, then nothing. They buried it again, deeper this time, face down, a coin on the tongue, a nail through the heel. It rained the next morning, for the first time in weeks, and for a while the village rested, but the mother never stopped listening, not even years later, when the room had been repainted, when another child was born, when life returned, because sometimes, even in summer, the blankets would still feel cold, and the candles would flicker without wind, and sometimes, just sometimes, she would wake in the middle of the night to the sound of breathing coming from nowhere. It doesn't bite you, it doesn't claw through windows or bare fangs in the night. It doesn't need to, because the Moroi is quiet. It slips in when no one is watching, when the room is still, when the breath catches, when the infant's cradle suddenly stills without reason. It isn't a vampire, but it's worse in many ways, because it doesn't ask for permission, and it doesn't wait for darkness. In Romanian folklore, the Moroi is a spirit, a cursed soul, a being that never belonged in this world to begin with. Some say it is the ghost of a child who died unbaptized. Others claim it's born, living but marked, carrying something dark inside its bones that no priest or mother can undo. It feeds on the living, not with teeth, but with breath, with shadow, with presence. It can drain a person of life over weeks, slowly, gently, until there's nothing left but skin and silence. Villagers knew the signs: milk that curdled by moonlight, livestock that stopped eating, children who grew pale and thin without illness, dreams that left people waking breathless, as if something had been sitting on their chest. No blood, no wounds, just a slow unravelling of the soul. That's the Moroi. They said it never really died, because it was never fully born. It lives in between breath and silence, between innocence and punishment, between the grave and the world above it, and it doesn't knock, it doesn't ask, it comes back because it was never finished. There are stories of Moroi who return after a night, others after years. Some drift through their old homes, leaving frost on the windows and dead birds by the doors. Others enter people's dreams, softly at first, until the dreamer forgets how to wake. Some Moroi stay children forever, others grow, their form changes, their needs deepen. There were whispers of one that fed off the breath of its sister for 7 nights, until she died holding its name in her mouth. Another that followed a man from village to village for years, never seen, only felt. He aged twice as fast and died with his teeth still clenched shut. And yet, no one agrees on how to stop it. Some say you must dig up the body and burn it. Others insist on staking the corpse through the mouth or nailing it face down to the coffin. Still more say the only way to banish a Moroi is to finish what was never done in life, a proper baptism, a name spoken in love, a death met without shame. But these are only stories, and the truth is far colder. Because in every village that speaks of the Moroi, there's one thing no one ever says aloud. What if it never left? What if it's still here? Still watching? Still listening? Because the Moroi don't haunt ruins. It doesn't belong to crumbling castles or ancient legends. It belongs to the breath behind your neck when no one's there. The window that won't stay closed. The baby that cries for no reason, then stops all at once. It is not a monster. It is a memory, a mistake, a child who was never given a name, and a spirit that was never told to rest. Not all Moroi crawl out of graves. Some are born breathing, and that's what makes them more dangerous, because you don't expect it. Not from something so small, so quiet, so clean. But villagers knew the signs. They didn't need a priest or scholar, just a flicker of instinct, a shadow where light should have been. The child looks like any other, but the mother feels it in her bones. Even as she holds him, she knows. His skin stays cold no matter how many blankets. His eyes open too wide, too soon. He doesn't cry when he's hungry. He doesn't smile when he's full. And the cat won't go near him. They call it a curse, but that's too simple. A true Moroi is not just cursed. He is marked, before breath, before name. Sometimes with a call across the face at birth. Sometimes with teeth already forming. Sometimes with a second shadow that flickers out of sync with his own. You don't speak of it at first. You wait. You hope. You wrap garlic in the cradle's corners. You whisper prayers over the milk. But the signs don't go away. The baby's room grows colder than the others. The older sibling begins to sleepwalk. The livestock grow thin, though they eat the same. And then one day, the neighbour's infant dies in its sleep. No illness, no struggle. Just a small mouth frozen open as if it had been gasping. They say the Moroi can feed from miles away, that the breath it takes from others makes its own chest rise stronger, that it doesn't need to touch its victims, only think of them. And worst of all, it doesn't know it's doing it. Not always. Some grow into it slowly, a child who drains others' energy, who stares too long without blinking, who leaves bruises on those who sleep beside him, not from hands, from hunger. Villagers began watching their own, children with strange birthmarks, children who seemed too perfect, children whose mothers died in childbirth, as if they'd been emptied. You don't accuse a child, not at first, but you start to notice that birds die on the windowsill outside his room, that his breath doesn't fog the mirror in winter, that his voice sounds older than it should when he speaks and dreams. In one village they told the story of a boy who never aged. He grew, yes, but too fast. He spoke in full sentences by the age of 1. By 3, he asked to sleep in the cellar, away from the others. At 5, his aunt was found with blood in her lungs, her eyes open to something no one else could see. They begged the priest to intervene, but the priest wouldn't enter the house. No one accused him aloud. But when the house caught fire one night, no one helped, and no one asked if the boy was inside. Because sometimes the only way to kill a living Moroi is to pretend it never existed. The midwives kept their own records, lists of signs, of warnings. They watched the babies as they came out, eyes wide and limbs too stiff. Some were marked and raised, others were smothered before their first breath. It wasn't cruelty, it was protection. Because a dead Moroi might take your breath away once, but a living one would never stop. The hardest thing is not when the Moroi comes from the grave, it's when it comes from your own womb. When the thing that haunts your house was once something you held to your chest, something you named, something you fed with trembling hands, because no one wants to believe it. Not at first. They explain the fever, the dead livestock, the pale cheeks of the neighbour's boy, the night sounds, the smell of damp wool and open earth that fills the house even with the windows closed. They say it's grief, or mould, or illness. But then the dreams begin, and it's always the same. You wake gasping, as if something was pressed to your chest. The sound of breathing close to your face. The sense that your own blood has been siphoned through invisible threads while you slept. Then the priest comes, and he doesn't step inside. He stands at the edge of the threshold. He holds a sprig of dried basil. He asks questions, but not about the living. He wants to know when the baby died, whether he was baptized, whether you noticed a wetness on the lips when you open the casket, and you lie, because you must. But he already knows. In villages across Romania, there were stories of families forced to do what no one should. They called it the blood price, the moment when love had to be replaced by survival. It began with signs and ended with digging. They unearthed their children, their sisters, their husbands, their wives. They opened the graves and looked inside, hoping desperately that decay had done its job. But when the skin was too smooth, the lips too pink, the eyes still half open, they knew. And then came the decision. Sometimes it was a stake, through the mouth. Sometimes it was decapitation, the head placed between the feet. In some places they removed the heart and burned it, scattered the ashes into water and forced the afflicted to drink. And sometimes they made a mistake, because not all Moroi were in the ground. Sometimes the family turned on the wrong one, a child who was sick, a cousin who looked too long at the wrong moment, a daughter who woke screaming from dreams she couldn't explain. One story tells of a girl named Alina. She was 13 when her brother died in his sleep. No marks, no struggle, just gone. The next night her mother fell ill, then the dog, then the neighbour's child. The village whispered. They remembered that Alina was born with a veil over her face, that she spoke in her sleep, that the priest had refused to baptize her until the 3rd attempt. They watched her, they waited, and then one night, they took her to the river. They said it was for protection, that they would tie her hands and test her. If she floated, she was cursed. If she sank, she was innocent. She floated, and they left her there, not because they were evil, not because they hated her, but because they were afraid. Because once a Moroi entered your house, you would do anything to make it leave, even if it meant paying in blood, even if the blood was your own. They were the first to see it, before the priest, before the mother, before the villagers ever whispered the word Moroi. The midwife was there at the beginning, when the first cry should have come, when the light hit the infant's skin just wrong, when the blood on her hands felt colder than it should have. She saw everything, and she knew what not to say. Because in the dark Balkans, in the forests where wolves howled closer than bells rang, midwives were more than caretakers. They were keepers of secrets. They knew which babies would live, which mothers wouldn't, and which children should never have been born at all. They called them touched, or silent. or watched, but never by their true name, Moroi, because speaking it aloud made it stronger. The midwives kept lists, folded into leather pouches tucked under bed sealed with wax, lists of omens, a baby born under an eclipse, one with a veil across its face, one whose afterbirth came too late, one who didn't scream, but stared. And when those signs appeared, when the breath came too shallow, when the room turned still, when the goats refused to eat from the straw beneath the crib, they knew what must be done, but it was never written, only whispered. Some sprinkled ash in the bathwater, others hung chicken hearts above the door. A few slipped tiny iron pins under the infant's mattress and told the mother it was for good luck. But some went further. There were stories, quiet ones, of midwives who held the newborn a moment too long, who pressed just a little harder against the chest, who whispered a prayer while the mother bled and let the child go. It was mercy, not for the baby, for the village, because they had seen what happened when the signs were ignored. The boy who grew too fast, the girl who couldn't speak but left others voiceless, the infant who died once and came back. Midwives bore the burden, and they bore it alone. Because when the priest saw a Moroi, he lit incense. When the father saw one, he sharpened stakes. But when the midwife saw it, she made a decision, life or safety. No one thanked her. Some feared her. Some avoided her touch. Others blamed her when things went wrong. But late at night, when the coughing started, when the child wouldn't wake, when milk soured and dreams grew heavy, they called for her anyway, because she knew, she always knew. And sometimes she didn't act fast enough. There's one tale, never written down, of a child born with two hearts, one that beat loud in the chest, one that pulsed only in the shadow. The midwife saw it in the eyes, too knowing, too calm. She hesitated, and 3 days later the pig stopped eating. The firewood soaked itself through. The child's mother walked into the forest and didn't return. When the midwife finally came back with the others and opened the cradle, it was empty, not just of the baby, of warmth, of air, of anything that should have belonged to the living. They never found the child. They burned the house, and the midwife never delivered again. Because once you let a Moroi live, it doesn't forget, and it doesn't forgive. There is no scream, no blood, no teeth marks, no torn sheets. When the Moroi feeds, it does not devour the body. It unravels it, quietly, lovingly, as if death were a kind of embrace. You wake up weaker than the day before. Your breath shortens, your hands shake, your skin grows colder no matter how many blankets cover you. The doctor finds nothing wrong, and that's how you know it's begun. Because a Moroi doesn't need to be seen. It only needs to be near. Sometimes it waits at the foot of your bed. Sometimes it hovers behind the curtain. Sometimes it follows you in your dreams and sits on your chest when you forget how to speak. They called it wasting, the old word, a slow disappearance from the inside out. And the victim almost always smiled. That was the worst part, because as the Moroi fed, it made sure you welcomed it. It gave you visions of dead lovers returned, of warm arms in the dark, of mothers who never left. You'd hear their voices in your dreams, feel them stroke your hair, whisper your name in a voice no one else could hear, and you'd call back, even if your mouth never moved. One breath at a time, it emptied you, until you became a husk of yourself, and then, just before the end, you stopped resisting, because you wanted it to stay. That's how it survived. Not through violence, but through longing. And it fed best on the lonely, the widows, the sick, the ones no one visited anymore. The children left too long in cold cribs. It came for the ones already half ghost, and pulled them gently the rest of the way. In some villages they tried to fight it. They placed garlic in every window, hung holy symbols from every beam, burned incense until the walls wept soot, but it wasn't enough. because the Moroi doesn't knock. It doesn't enter through doors. It comes through memory, through grief, through the places inside you that ache when you think no one is watching. There's one tale of a woman whose sister died of wasting. No fever, no wound, just a slow unravelling of colour, of voice, of warmth. She tried everything, herbs, prayers, salt lines. But each morning her sister's hair was colder, her eyes glassy, her breath so faint it barely moved the curtain thread placed at her lips. And then one night, the sister rose, not fully, just enough to stand, to walk, eyes closed, to the far wall of the house. She placed her hand on it, softly, like a child touching the womb of a home, and then she whispered, "Let me back in." The sister watched and did nothing, because she realised in that moment she hadn't lost her sister, she had shared her. The Moroi hadn't come to take, it had come to feed, to belong, to remind the lonely that something still wanted them, even if it was death in another shape. That's what made it worse than a vampire, worse than a ghost. It made you want it, need it, call it by name without even knowing. And when it was finished, when the breath was gone and the skin grew hollow, there was still no wound, only silence and a smile. The first grave never holds. You can dig deep, stone the walls, salt the earth. It won't matter, because the Moroi doesn't rest where it's placed. It rises where it was loved, or feared, or named, and you can't bury a name. The villagers learned this early. They said you had 3 days to get it right, 3 days after death before the spirit decided whether to stay down or come back hungry. So the rituals began. First, plug the mouth with soil, not too much, just enough to silence what was never confessed. Then, turn the corpse face down, so it would dig deeper into the earth, not climb out. If the death was sudden, unnatural, they added iron spikes, through the legs, the arms, sometimes the heart, and if the sign still appeared, if the dreams returned, if the livestock turned their backs to the wind, if the children woke with blue lips, they dug again. The second burial was always crueler, because it was no longer just grief, it was punishment. They removed the head and placed it between the knees. They burned the shroud. They poured vinegar over the bones and chanted prayers no priest had ever written down. And still, some came back, not as flesh, not as bone, but as weight. You'd feel it pressing against your spine, trailing your footsteps, stealing warmth from your breath in winter. It didn't need a body anymore, because once you called something Moroi, once you believed it was real, you fed it. You kept it alive. So how do you bury something like that? Some said fire, but ashes scatter, they travel. Others said baptism, even after death. But that only works if the soul still listens. A few tried to forget, to erase the name, to never speak of the child, the brother, the wife. But forgetting is its own kind of grave, and even that can be dug through. In one village, they buried a girl 6 times, each time deeper, each time colder. But the father insisted she still stood at the window at night, whispering songs only he remembered. So on the 7th attempt, they did something different. They brought no shovels, no priests, no torches, just silence. They sat by her grave for 3 nights, told stories of her life, only the kind ones, spoke her name like it meant something beautiful, and then they left, and she never came back. Maybe that's the secret. Maybe the Moroi rises because it wants to be remembered, and we bury it wrong because we're afraid to mourn, because it's easier to strike, to burn, to stake than it is to grieve. They say the cottage is empty, the roof has caved, the stone oven is cold, the vines have taken the door, and the well out back hasn't held water since the snow turned to ash that one winter long ago. But the window stays clean. No one touches it. No one washes it. Yet there's never dust on the glass. Some say it's the wind. Others say it's guilt, but the old woman knows better. She's the only one who walks the path past the orchard, the only one who still leaves dried basil tied in twine on the doorstep, the only one who won't speak her name, because she remembers what the others buried, what the priest refused to bless, what the mother refused to hold, what the father swore he never saw, even as it climbed into bed with him each night and whispered with the breath of frost. The Moroi didn't go. It never does. It just waits until you stop watching, until you stop fearing it, until you open your heart again to something soft and fragile, until a new cradle is carved, and a new child is born with eyes that are too dark, too deep, too knowing. Then it breathes again, not through its own mouth, but through yours, because the Moroi don't live in the woods or the grave. It lives in the things you forget to grieve, in the silence at the end of the lullaby, in the cold side of the bed, in the name you only speak in your sleep. So when they say the cottage is empty, listen closely. You might hear her still, just behind the door, singing.